She was 20 years old and she had nothing. Not a place to sleep, not a family waiting for her, not a single person in the world whose legal obligation was to keep her alive. What she had was $47 folded inside a worn brown leather wallet, a single small canvas backpack that held everything she owned in this world, and a manila envelope that had been waiting for her on the morning she walked out of the group home for the last time. Nobody knew what was inside that envelope. The social worker who handed it to her didn't know. The probate office in Sandpoint, Idaho didn't know. Even Cora herself didn't know. But what that envelope contained would become the most important decision of her life, all wrapped up in 3 small pieces of paper that would lead her to something her grandfather had been preparing for her for the last 30 years, something that would change everything. The morning Cora turned 20 years old, she stepped through the heavy metal side door of the Bonner County Youth Services Group home, and she didn't look back. The brick building on Pine Street had been her entire world for 4 years. That was where she had slept, where she had eaten, where she had learned what it meant to belong to no one. 3 roommates who cycled through the system like everyone else. A curfew that meant she had to be inside by 9 o'clock every night. A single narrow shelf above her bed that she had been allowed to call her own. The only space in the entire building where anything belonged to just her. And now, on the morning of her 20th birthday, the state of Idaho no longer had any legal responsibility for her. In practical terms, that meant she was done. Finished with the system, out on her own. The sky above the parking lot was the kind of gray that only happens in early April in the Idaho Panhandle. That dull pewter color that makes everything look like it's been waiting for something better for a very long time. Patches of old snow still clung to the shaded edges of the asphalt, slowly melting into thin, dark streams that ran toward the gutters. She could hear water dripping somewhere behind her, that patient sound of winter finally giving up. Just before she left, the tired social worker at the front desk, the same woman who had been there every day for the last 4 years, had pressed a thin manila envelope into her hand without saying much of anything. She just said it came in last week, that it belonged to her grandfather, and that somebody from the probate office thought she should have it. Cora had taken the envelope and put it in her backpack without opening it. She wasn't ready, not yet. The walk away from the group home felt like it took hours, but it probably only took minutes. Everything felt strange and slow that morning, like she was watching herself from very far away. The streets of Sandpoint were mostly empty. A few cars drove past. A man was sweeping the wooden sidewalk in front of a hardware store. Nobody paid attention to a young woman in worn work boots and a faded canvas backpack. She was nobody. She was invisible. And for the first time in her life, that didn't feel like a curse. It felt like freedom. She found a bench near the river, and she finally opened the manila envelope. Inside were 3 things. The first was a short typewritten letter from a lawyer named Mr. Hollis Beaumont. The second was a small hand-drawn map showing the route to a property somewhere east of town, along something called Cedar Mountain Road. The third was a single sentence typed at the bottom of the letter that made Cora read the entire paragraph 4 times, to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding what she was reading. The sentence said that to claim the property, she only needed to pay $10 in accumulated back taxes to the Bonner County treasurer. $10. She read it again. $10 to claim a piece of land in Bonner County, which was worth real money. A cup of coffee at the diner cost more than that. This could only mean one of 2 things. Either someone had made a massive mistake and moved a decimal point somewhere in the chain of probate offices, or this property was so worthless that nobody in the entire county had ever wanted to pay even $10 to claim it. Cora looked at her wallet. She had exactly $47 left in the world. If she spent 10 of it on this mysterious property, she would have $37 to find a place to sleep, to eat, to figure out what came next. The alternative was to spend her money on a cheap motel for a few nights. And after that, the social worker had already explained to her that she would probably end up in a transitional shelter in Coeur d'Alene or Spokane. Neither option felt good, but at least one of them felt like it had a story to it. At least one of them felt like maybe, just maybe, something was waiting for her out there. The letter didn't sound like a joke. The lawyer didn't sound like someone who played games. And Cora remembered her grandfather. She remembered the smell of cedar shavings on his old woolwork shirt. She remembered the way he had taught her to write her name with a real fountain pen, dipping the steel nib into dark green ink at a kitchen table when she was 7 years old. He had been a builder once, and then he had been a teacher for 35 years after that. He wasn't the kind of man to play jokes. The next morning, she walked into the small wood-paneled law office of Mr. Hollis Beaumont on the corner of Main Street and First Avenue in Sandpoint. The lawyer was 71 years old with silver hair and round wire-rimmed reading glasses hanging from a thin black cord around his neck. He looked up from a stack of papers as she entered, and he studied her for a long moment. The worn canvas backpack, the work boots with holes in the toes, the careful way she stood at the edge of the rug, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be inside an office like this. "You must be Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. She nodded. He gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. "I wasn't sure you would come." "Why not?" she asked. Mr. Beaumont opened a manila folder of his own and laid it gently on the desk. He explained that most people didn't bother with properties like the one her grandfather had left her. There was no electricity. There was no running water. There was no plowed road access for half the year. The roof was falling apart. The well was dry. What she was getting was 12 acres of mountain forest, 2 miles east of town on Cedar Mountain Road, with a single small one-room schoolhouse sitting abandoned on it. The Bonner County School District had closed the school in 1971. It had been empty ever since. 50 years of Idaho weather had done its work on the building. Most people in town had forgotten it even existed. "But I can claim it for $10, Cora said. "Yes," Mr. Beaumont said, "if you choose to claim the property. The transfer fee and the accumulated back taxes come to exactly $10. Cora reached into her pocket and laid a worn $10 bill on the desk. It was wrinkled because she had folded it small and unfolded it twice on the walk over from the diner. The bill had probably been handled by 1,000 people before it got to her, and now it was going to change her entire life. Mr. Beaumont looked at the bill. Then he looked at her. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "It's all I have that I can spare," she said. Something in the old man's expression softened. He nodded slowly and slid the papers across the desk to her. Cora signed her name where he pointed. The pen trembled slightly in her hand as she wrote. When she finished, Mr. Beaumont closed the manila folder and reached into a small wooden drawer in his desk. He pulled out a single object and slid it across the desk toward her. It was a heavy old iron key on a tarnished brass ring. The metal was cold and surprisingly heavy in her palm. "That was left for you as well," Mr. Beaumont said. "Your grandfather left it with me in the autumn of 2022, 6 months before he died. He gave me very particular instructions. He said that when you came to claim the property, I was to put this key in your hand and nobody else's." Cora turned the key over slowly between her fingers. The metal was old and dark with age. "He also asked me to give you this," Mr. Beaumont said. He laid one more thing on the desk. A single folded sheet of cream cotton rag paper sealed at the fold with a small dab of deep red wax. The wax had a tiny chalk eraser pressed into it as a seal. A schoolteacher's mark. Cora picked it up carefully. She didn't open it. She tucked it into the inside pocket of her thin spring jacket against her chest. She would open it later, alone. Not here. Not in front of this stranger, even if he was being kind. "How do I get there?" she asked. Mr. Beaumont drew a small, careful map on the back of a blank envelope and slid it across the desk. 2 miles east on Cedar Mountain Road. Then a half-mile up an old timber spur. The schoolhouse was in a clearing on the south side of the spur. She thanked him and walked out of the law office into the bright morning. The sun was starting to break through the gray, and the air smelled like spring finally coming. She walked across Main Street to the diner and spent the last of the cash she could spare on a single black coffee and a bowl of oatmeal. Then she shouldered her canvas backpack. and she began walking east out of Sandpoint toward Cedar Mountain Road. The walk took her nearly 3 hours. Cedar Mountain Road wound up out of the Penn-Dorail River Valley into the foothills of the Selkirk Mountains. Through tall stands of cedar and ponderosa pine, the asphalt gave way to gravel after the first mile, and the gravel gave way to packed dirt after the second. The air grew cleaner and colder the higher she climbed. Patches of late spring snow still clung to the shaded north sides of the trees. Her canvas backpack felt heavier with every step, like gravity was slowly increasing just for her. When the old timber spur finally appeared on her left, it was barely visible, just 2 faint tire tracks cutting through the spring weeds and disappearing into the trees. She turned onto the spur and walked a half-mile farther into the forest. The clearing opened ahead of her without any warning. For a long moment, Cora just stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at what her grandfather had left her. The schoolhouse was smaller than she had expected from the photograph in her backpack. A single-story white-painted timber frame building, 24 feet by 16, with a steep cedar shake roof that had turned silver gray from 40 years of Idaho mountain weather. A small covered front porch sagged slightly on its left side. A short stone chimney rose from the back. 2 tall, narrow-paned windows along the south wall. 1 small window in the gable end. A worn cedar plank front door with a heavy black iron hasp and a heavy iron padlock through the hasp. The white paint had long ago weathered to a soft silver cream color. Spring grass had grown up almost to the porch boards. A small swing-set frame, rust orange and lonely, stood in the side yard with its chains missing. A heart pine flagpole stood at the front of the clearing with no flag on it. Behind the schoolhouse, 12 acres of recovering Idaho cedar and ponderosa pine stretched up the gentle south slope of Cedar Mountain. This was the property she had just paid $10 to claim. This was what her inheritance looked like. Cora let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Well," she said softly to nobody at all. "Hello there." She walked across the clearing to the worn cedar plank porch. The boards creaked under her feet, but they held. She slid the heavy iron key on the tarnished brass ring out of her jacket pocket. She fit the key into the heavy iron padlock for a moment. The lock resisted. The metal hadn't turned in years. She took a slow, steady breath and tried again. The lock gave way with a single sudden quiet clunk. The hasp came loose from the staple. The padlock fell open in her hand. She set the padlock down on the porch railing and pushed open the worn cedar plank door. The interior smelled of cold cedar and old chalk and the soft, dry, musty silence of a building that had been closed up for many seasons. The pale April light from the south wall windows lay across the wide plank floor in 2 long bands. 12 old wooden student desks were arranged in 3 neat rows facing the front of the room, each one paired with its own small chair. The teacher's heart pine desk stood at the front of the room, with its high stool tucked carefully underneath. A long black chalkboard ran the full length of the front wall. A cast iron potbelly stove stood at the back of the room, beside a small wood box. Cora set her backpack down on the closest student desk and walked slowly between the rows. She trailed the fingertips of her right hand across the worn maple desktops. Each desk had a name carved into the underside of its lid. Hazel Boggs, 1959. Carter Peton, 1962. Sally Whitcomb, 1968. 35 years of small, careful hands had passed through this room. Her grandfather, William Whitmore, had stood at the front of this room and taught every one of them. She walked to the back of the room and lifted aside the heavy iron lid of the wood box. Instead of the cordwood she had half expected, she found something else. A small old wooden crate the size of a milk box, made of weathered cedar boards, with 2 thick rope handles on the sides. The lid was held shut by a single small brass clasp. The wood was darkened by years of dust and the slow, patient breath of Idaho weather. Cora knelt down on the wide plank floor and slowly slid the crate out of the wood box. It was heavier than it looked. She set it on the floor in front of her and undid the brass clasp. Inside the crate, Arranged carefully in 2 rows were 12 clear glass canning jars, the kind people used to preserve tomatoes and peaches in the summer. Each jar had a clear glass lid and a brass screw band. Cora frowned softly and lifted one jar out. It was much heavier than an empty canning jar should be. She held the jar up toward the pale April light from the south wall window. Inside the jar, packed tightly together, were rolled bundles of green paper held by old rubber bands. For a long second, Cora's mind refused to understand what she was looking at. She set the jar down on the floor with a small soft clink and lifted out a second jar. The second jar was the same. She lifted out the third, the fourth. Every single jar was filled to the brass screw band, lid with tightly rolled green bundles. Her hands began to shake. She sat down hard on the wide plank floor in front of the crate. She unscrewed the brass screw band. On the first jar slowly, she lifted out a single bundle and unrolled it carefully against her knee. $20 bills, 40 of them. $800 in a single bundle. Cora stared at the bundle in her lap. She did not breathe. She lifted out another bundle from the same jar and counted it. 40 more bills. Another $800. There were 5 bundles in the first jar. $4,000 in a single jar of canning glass. 12 jars in the crate. Cora put her hands flat on the wide plank floor on either side of her knees and bowed her head and just breathed for a long minute. Beneath the bottom layer of jars, when she finally lifted them out, was a single, thick, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn and darkened with age. Embossed in faded gold letters across the front was a single name, William Whitmore. Her grandfather. She lifted the journal out carefully and laid it on the wide plank floor and opened it to the first page. The first page was not a journal entry. It was a letter written in her grandfather's slow, steady hand. My Cora, if you are reading this, it means 3 things. First, it means you made it to your 20th birthday. Second, it means you were brave enough to come and find this place. And third, it means you were curious enough to open the wood box. That makes me smile. You probably think the money is the important part of what I have left you. It isn't. The money is just a tool. I have left the schoolhouse to you because the schoolhouse is the thing that mattered. Your grandmother and I built this schoolhouse together in the spring of 1937. The year I came back from the timber camps and married her, I taught the children of Cedar Mountain Road inside this schoolhouse. For the next 35 years, the Bonner County School District closed the district in 1971 when the families on Cedar Mountain Road moved into town. I bought the schoolhouse from the county for $2 in 1972. I have spent every summer since then quietly fixing one small thing about it. The roof shakes, the chimney mortar, the cedar floorboards, the desk lids. I have been keeping the schoolhouse standing for 54 years because I knew that one morning, my Cora, you would come up Cedar Mountain Road and you would need it. The cash in the jars is for tools and lumber and food and a wood stove pipe and a new well pump and whatever else you need to make this place livable again. Spend it carefully. There is enough. Do not let anyone in town tell you what to build here. The schoolhouse is yours. Whatever you make of it will be the right thing. I am sorry I could not be there for you when you were small. I tried. The system was not built for old men with bad hearts to win custody fights. I lost. I have spent 15 years sorry about that. But you are here now, and so am I in the only way I know how to be. Welcome home, my Cora. Build something good. Your grandfather, William Tobias Whitmore, October 3rd, 2022. Cora laid the journal flat on the wide plank floor and sat in the pale April light for a long time. The schoolhouse around her was very quiet. She did not cry. She put her hand flat on the cover of her grandfather's journal, and she said quietly, "Hello, Grandpa. I came." That first night, Cora slept on the wide plank floor of the schoolhouse. Beneath a single old canvas tarp, she found folded carefully behind the cast-iron stove. The April night in the Selkirk Mountains was cold. She lit a small fire in the pot-belly stove, using a stack of dry kindling her grandfather had left for her in the wood box under the crate. The cast-iron stove caught on the second match. Slowly, slowly the schoolhouse warmed. She did not sleep much. She lay on the floorboards, in front of the warm stove, and listened to the new mountain quiet of her new life. Wind moved through the cedar branches outside. Somewhere down the slope, a single owl called once, twice, then nothing. The cast-iron stove ticked softly as it warmed. In the morning, she walked back into Sandpoint. The town looked different in the second morning light. The diner was open. The hardware store across the street was open. The man who ran the hardware store was sweeping the wood plank sidewalk in front of his door when Cora walked up. He was perhaps 70 years old, lean, slightly stooped, with weathered hands, and a neat white mustache and a pair of round wire rimmed spectacles tucked into the chest pocket of his red flannel work shirt. He looked up as Cora approached. His eyes were a warm, faded gray. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Cora said. He studied her backpack. He studied her worn work boots. He studied the careful way she stood with her shoulders slightly curved inward, like she was used to making herself small. "You fixing something?" he asked. Cora hesitated. An old schoolhouse out past Cedar Mountain Road. For a long moment, the old man's face did not change. Then, both of his eyebrows lifted slightly, and a soft smile reached the corners of his mouth. "You mean the old Whitmore place," he said. Cora blinked. "You know it." The man chuckled quietly. "Everybody on Cedar Mountain Road knows that place." He set the broom carefully against the wall of the hardware store. He stepped around the threshold and held the door open for her. "Come on inside, young lady. If somebody is finally going to make that old schoolhouse right again, we had better get you set up with the right tools." His name was Mr. Hollis Boggs. He had been the owner of Boggs Hardware on Main Street in Sandpoint for 43 years. He had been one of Mr. William Whitmore's students at the Cedar Mountain Schoolhouse in 1959. His name was carved into the underside of the second desk in the third row. Mr. Boggs did not ask Cora a single question about where she got her money. He helped her pick out a heavy axe, a long-handle shovel, a sturdy claw hammer, a pound of 2.5-inch galvanized roofing nails, a roll of heavy black tar paper, a small bow saw, and a thick pair of leather work gloves in a size that fit her small hands. He carried the gloves to the front counter himself. "How much?" Cora asked. Mr. Boggs rang up the items on his old brass cash register. The total came to $124. Cora paid in $20 bills from the first canning jar, and Mr. Boggs counted the bills slowly. He looked at her once over the rims of his round wire-rimmed spectacles. He did not say anything about the bills. He gave her her change in clean new singles. Then, he slid a small business card across the counter to her. "My home number is on the back," he said. "Call me when you start the roof. I will drive out and show you how to lay the shakes properly, so they last another 40 years. Cora carried the bag of tools out of the hardware store. The morning was bright and cold. She walked back up Cedar Mountain Road to the schoolhouse with the axe in her right hand and the bag of tools over her left shoulder. That afternoon she began. She started with the cedar shakes on the south slope of the roof. There were 41 of them missing, or rotted beyond repair. She climbed up the small wooden ladder Mr. Boggs had loaned her, and she pulled the rotted edges of the old shakes away. She measured. She cut new cedar shakes from a stack of new shakes she had bought from Mr. Boggs. She nailed each new shake into the old roof boards. By the end of the first afternoon, her hands were blistered. Her arms were burning, and her right shoulder ached so badly she could barely lift it. But the south slope of the roof was 15 new shakes closer to being whole. That night, she slept on the floor of the schoolhouse with a new wool blanket she had bought from Mr. Boggs draped over her shoulders. The cast-iron stove warmed the room. In the morning, she got up and climbed the ladder again. The weeks slipped by like that, each day bringing its own small victories and exhaustion. Mr. Boggs drove out the second weekend in his old beige Ford F-100 pickup with a load of cedar shakes in the bed, and he stood on the roof beside Cora and showed her how to lap the shakes properly so the snow melt would not work back up under them. He came out the third weekend, with a retired Bonner County well driller named Mr. Roscoe Tilden, and the two of them spent a full afternoon teaching Cora how to prime an old hand-pump well from the small spring at the back of the property. He came out the fifth weekend with a quiet retired schoolteacher from Sandpoint named Miss Ida Fairbanks, who had been Mr. Banks, William Whitmore's teaching colleague at the Cedar Mountain Schoolhouse for the last 11 years before the district closed. Miss Fairbanks brought a hot loaf of brown bread and a quart of homemade huckleberry preserves wrapped in a clean cotton dish towel. "He told me about you the year before he died," Miss Fairbanks said softly, sitting on the front porch steps of the schoolhouse, beside Cora in the warm, late May sun. "He told me he was leaving you the schoolhouse. He told me he hoped you would come." Cora did not know what to say. She held the warm loaf of brown bread in her lap and just listened. Word about the Whitmore schoolhouse spread slowly through Sandpoint, the way news spreads in a small mountain town. One morning, a cardboard box appeared on the porch of the schoolhouse with 12 old enamel-coated cooking pots and a kettle and a small set of dishes inside. There was no note. Another morning, Cora found a stack of new cedar fence boards leaned carefully against the side of the woodshed. Another morning, she found a small wooden crate of new books on the porch, a set of Anne of Green Gables, a set of The Wind in the Willows, a stack of Boxcar Children, a copy of Charlotte's Web. The card on top of the books simply said, "For the schoolhouse." Mr. Boggs would not say who had left them. By the time the high summer came to the Selkirks, the schoolhouse was no longer an abandoned building. The cedar shake roof was new. The cast iron stove had been blacked and reported. The south wall windows had been reglazed by a Sandpoint glazier, who had refused to charge Cora for the work. The wide plank floor had been hand-sanded and finished with a soft oil-based varnish. The chalkboard at the front of the room had been wiped clean and reblacked. The teacher's heart pine desk had been moved back into place. The 12 old student desks had been sanded down and refinished. A small bookshelf along the north wall held the children's books and a slowly growing collection of donated storybooks from Sandpoint families. Mr. Boggs had hand-built a new cedar plank front door for Cora. The door hung heavy and true on its black iron hinges. A small brass mail slot was cut into the lower panel. The well at the back of the property pumped clean, cold water again. On a Saturday morning in late August, Cora hung a small hand-painted wooden sign on the new cedar plank front door of the schoolhouse. The sign read in soft, careful lettering she had practiced for a week, "Whitmore Schoolhouse Reading Room. Open Saturdays. All children welcome. No charge." The first Saturday she sat on the porch from 9 inches the morning until 3 inches the afternoon, and no one came. The second Saturday, 2 small children walked up Cedar Mountain Road from the Piton Ranch hand in hand, a brother and a sister of 8 and 10. They borrowed a copy of The Wind in the Willows and the Boxcar Children. Cora sat on the front porch with them for an hour and read aloud the first chapter of The Wind in the Willows in the warm late summer light, while the 2 children sat very still on the porch boards on either side of her. By the third Saturday, 5 children came. By the fourth Saturday, 11. By the time September arrived, the schoolhouse had become something the town had not known it needed. On Saturday mornings, the front porch was crowded with bicycles. Children sat in the old student desks reading. Some of them stayed all day. Their parents drove out from town in the evenings to pick them up and to sit for a while on the front porch with Cora and have a cup of coffee from the cast iron range. Mr. Boggs began coming out on Saturday afternoons. He sat at the back of the schoolroom in a small wooden chair Cora had set out for him, and he read the Sandpoint Daily Bee. While the children read, Miss Fairbanks began coming out too on Sunday afternoons and reading aloud to whichever children stayed. One afternoon in mid-September, when the porch was empty and the last late afternoon sun was coming in through the south wall windows, Cora sat at the teacher's heart pine desk and opened her grandfather's leather journal again. She had read most of it by now. The middle of the journal was full of his careful sketches and notes, measurements for the roof, plans for the chimney, sketches of the kind of bookshelves he had thought might one day go along the north wall. A hand-drawn page from the spring of 2018 that read in his slow, steady teacher's hand. Cora would be 12 this April. I think of her every morning. The last page of the journal was a single short sentence. It was the only writing on that page. A strong foundation matters more than anything you build on top of it. Cora stared at the line for a long time. She had thought the first time she had read it that her grandfather had meant the concrete pier blocks of the schoolhouse foundation. But sitting at the teacher's desk now in the warm late summer light, she understood that he had meant something else entirely. The foundation was not the building. The foundation was the person standing inside it. Every long morning of work, every blistered hand, every cold first night on the wide plank floor under a single canvas tarp, every quiet hour with Mr. Boggs on the cedar shake roof, every loaf of brown bread Miss Fairbanks had brought up Cedar Mountain Road. Those were the foundation, not the schoolhouse itself. Those were the things that had made Cora strong enough to build something that mattered. That evening, Cora carried 2 small wooden chairs out onto the front porch of the schoolhouse, and she sat in one of them, and she watched the sun drop behind the long ridge of the Selkirk Mountains. The sky turned the slow, soft pink of late September. A cool mountain wind moved through the cedar branches across the clearing. Somewhere down the slope, a single owl called once, and then again. The schoolhouse behind her was warm. The cast-iron stove was burning low. The $47 she had walked out of the group home with on the morning of her 20th birthday were long ago spent, but the canning jars in the wood box had not yet run dry. Mr. Boggs had taught her to keep a careful ledger of every dollar she spent. She had spent the money the way her grandfather had asked her to carefully, on tools and lumber and a new well pump and a new wood stovepipe and the books on the north wall shelves and warm winter clothes that fit her small hands. She had not spent any of the money on herself beyond what she needed. She had kept what was left in a small, careful account at the First Mountain Bank of Sandpoint that Mr. Boggs had helped her open in May. The account had her name on it. Cora Margaret Whitmore. There were still long winters ahead of her. There were still cedar shakes to replace on the north slope of the roof. There was still the second small woodshed she wanted to build. There were still chairs and desks she wanted to refinish, but that was all right, because the slow, careful building of a thing with your own 2 hands is, in the end, the only thing worth doing at all. Cora leaned back in the small wooden chair and looked out across the clearing. The same clearing most people would have walked past without a second glance. The same 12 acres of cedar forest and old schoolhouse that nobody in Bonner County had wanted for 50 years. The same piece of forgotten Idaho that someone had once decided was worth only $10. To her, it was worth everything, because it had given her something far more valuable than the money in the canning jars. It had given her a place to begin. It had given her a future. It had given her a grandfather's love stretched across decades, and finally reaching her on the morning of her 20th birthday. It had given her community and purpose, and the knowledge that somewhere, someone had believed in her before she believed in herself. It was the best $10 she ever spent.